Eastern Front, 1942. Somewhere over occupied Soviet territory, a German soldier hears something in the dark. Not an engine, not a siren, a soft whooshing, like a broom sweeping through the night sky. He has 3 seconds before the bombs hit. The plane that drops them is made of plywood and canvas. It was designed in 1928 for crop dusting. The pilot is a 20-year-old woman who is not wearing a parachute, and she has already done this 7 times tonight. Before dawn, she will do it 11 more. In the summer of 1941, Germany was tearing through the Soviet Union. The Red Army was hemorrhaging men. Entire divisions were being encircled and annihilated. Moscow itself was under threat. That June, a woman named Marina Raskova started receiving letters, hundreds of them, then thousands. Soviet women had watched their brothers killed, their homes burned, their villages erased, and they wanted to fight. Raskova was not an ordinary woman. She was the first female navigator in the Soviet Air Force, a national celebrity, and she had a direct line to Stalin. In October 1941, she convinced him to authorize something no nation had ever attempted: 3 all-female air combat regiments. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, ground crew, every single role filled by women. Volunteers flooded in. Most were between 17 to 26 years old. They were university students, factory workers, and flying club members. They cut their hair to 2-finger widths above the ears. They were issued men's uniforms so oversized they stuffed the boots with newspaper and rags just to walk. The most experienced pilots went to the fighter regiment. The second best went to the dive bomber regiment. The least experienced, the ones who had barely finished flight school, were assigned to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and they were given the worst planes in the Soviet Air Force. But here is what no one expected. The least qualified unit would become the most feared. The Polikarpov Po-2 was a biplane built in 1928. It was made of plywood stretched with canvas. The women called it a coffin with wings. It had an open cockpit, no radio, no radar, no gun sights, and no armor plating. If a single tracer bullet struck the fuselage, the entire plane could ignite like a match. Its top speed was 94 miles per hour. That is slower than the stall speed of a German Messerschmitt, which meant a German fighter literally could not fly slow enough to engage them without falling out of the sky. And each plane could only carry 2 bombs. 2, 1 under each wing. For a typical night, that meant a crew had to fly back to base, rearm, and take off again, 8, 12, sometimes 18 times before sunrise. Each sortie lasted 30 to 50 minutes, flying low through corridors of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. The women had no parachutes. If they were hit, they burned. If they crashed behind enemy lines, they carried pistols with one instruction: save the last bullet for yourself. And they did this every single night for 3 years. The regiment developed a technique that became legendary. They flew in formations of 3. 2 planes would deliberately attract the German searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries, drawing fire while twisting and diving as decoys. The 3rd plane would cut its engine completely and glide in total silence toward the target. The only sound the Germans heard was a soft whooshing over their heads, the wind passing through canvas wings. Then the bombs fell. The Germans said it sounded like a witch on a broomstick. They called the women Nachthexen, night witches. The women adopted the name with pride, but the Germans did not find it amusing. Soldiers became so terrified that they refused to light cigarettes after dark, afraid the glow would reveal their position to the silent planes circling above. Rumors spread through the German ranks that the Soviet government had injected these women with experimental chemicals that gave them the night vision of a cat. How else could ordinary women do this? The German High Command eventually issued an order. Any Luftwaffe pilot who shot down a single night witch would be automatically awarded the Iron Cross, the highest military decoration in the German armed forces. That is how afraid they were of teenage girls in plywood planes with 2 bombs. Nadezhda Popova was one of the first to volunteer. She was 19 years old. The Germans had invaded her hometown, turned her family's house into a Gestapo station, and murdered her brother. She flew 852 combat missions over the course of the war. One night, she returned to base and found 42 bullet holes in her aircraft. There were also holes in her flight map and holes in her helmet. She turned to her navigator and said, "Katya, my dear, we will live long." On her best night, she flew 18 consecutive sorties. That is 18 takeoffs, 18 bombing runs through searchlight corridors and anti-aircraft fire, and 18 landings in a single night. American bomber crews were rotated out of combat if they survived 25 missions. Popova flew 852. In winter, the open cockpits exposed crews to temperatures that dropped to minus 48 degrees Celsius during the Battle of Stalingrad. The metal parts of the aircraft became so cold that touching them with bare skin would tear the flesh from your hand. The women flew through this every night, navigating by moonlight, compass, and stopwatch, looking for the faint glow of a campfire or the spark of a lit match that would betray an enemy position below. By the end of the war, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had flown more than 23,000 combat sorties and dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They destroyed 17 river crossings, 9 railways, 26 warehouses, 12 fuel depots, and 176 armored vehicles. 23 of their members were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest military honor. They were the most decorated female unit in Soviet Air Force history. 32 of them never came home. And then the war ended. The Soviet Union decided they were finished. The 588th was disbanded 6 months after victory. When Moscow held its massive victory parade, every Air Force unit was invited to fly over the capital, every unit except the Night Witches. The official reason was that their planes were too slow for the formation. The same planes that had been fast enough to send them into combat every night for 3 years were suddenly too slow to fly in a parade. After the war, Soviet women were pushed back out of combat aviation. The Night Witches returned to ordinary lives. They became teachers, flight instructors, factory workers. Their story faded. Decades later, Nadezhda Popova reflected on the exclusion. She said, "They told us our aircraft were too slow for the victory parade. Those same aircraft had been good enough to send us to die in." Near the end of her life, at 91, Popova said she sometimes stared into the blackness and closed her eyes. She said she could still imagine herself as a young girl, up there in her little bomber, and she would ask herself, "Nadia, how did you do it?" 200 women flew Plywood biplanes into the most heavily defended airspace in the world every night for 3 years, and the only reward they asked for was to keep flying. The enemy gave them a name meant to humiliate them. They wore it like a badge of honor, and their own country could not even let them fly in a parade. If this story deserves to be remembered, subscribe and share it so it finally is.